Hey, it's Mauricio here, and you're watching episode 3 of the Ask Mauricio Show, your weekly real estate syndication Q&A show. And once again, just wanted to thank everyone for providing your questions. Looking forward to answering them this week. Again, if you've got any questions that you want me to answer, please just feel free to drop a comment below, and hopefully we'll answer those in the next episode. But without further ado, Courtney, let's go to question number 1.
Paul asks, should everyone have an asset protection plan? What are the most common mistakes made by those who don't believe they need one?
Paul, that's a great question, and it's actually a question I get quite a bit, and the answer quite simply is yes. Everyone should have an asset protection plan, and that doesn't mean it has to be anything fancy. Like an insurance policy is an asset protection plan. And in fact, I always say that insurance is always your first line of defense. No matter what structure or what sophisticated thing you've got going, insurance should always be your first line of defense. The purpose of sort of the entity structuring and everything else is in case that first line of insurance fails for whatever reason, and we've gone through those in several videos. So the answer to that is absolutely. And one of the biggest mistakes, I think, around this topic is people, especially when they're just starting out, they think they don't have an asset. It's like, hey, I don't own anything, or I don't have much in the way of assets, and so there's nothing to protect. And people forget that their W-2 job or any income that they have is an asset, right? And so if somebody was to get a judgment against you personally and there was no asset protection and structure in place, no insurance, what happens is I can get a judgment against your wages, and that judgment's good for 10 years. So I'm essentially attaching 10 years worth of income, and even if you're not making a ton of money now, that's still money that I can attach. Now, I can't get all of it. Depending on the state, I might be limited to getting 20 or 25% of your disposable income, but I can get it. And then what happens if 5 or 6 or 7 years from now I become more and more and more successful, I acquire more and more assets, or my income starts going up? That judgment's going to be on there for 10 years with an opportunity to renew that insurance for another 10 years. So even if you think you have no assets, if you have the ability to earn income, that to me is an asset. And so you always want to be thinking about asset protection, even if it's just insurance. But I think most of us, especially in the real estate world, and certainly in the real estate syndication world, we're going to go beyond insurance. We're going to have some level of entity structuring. And I know I just did a Flip Chart Friday video about how to structure your real estate syndication entities. We'll probably pop it, up here somewhere. But take a look at that video because that's really helpful. But the bottom line is, yes, everybody should have an asset protection strategy.
Daniel asks, in what states should you set up your entities? I'm always hearing about Nevada and Wyoming being the best.
This is another common question I get, and it all depends. It actually depends on the type of entity that you're creating and also where you're located, you're physically located. So, for example, if you have a business or even a property LLC, but basically if you've got an active business that you're doing business in, then that entity usually gets set up in the state where you're conducting the business. So if I have an operating company and I'm conducting business in California, then that entity is going to be set up in California because that's where I'm doing business. Even if I set it up somewhere else, because I'm doing business in that state, I'm going to be required to register or qualify that entity back into that particular state anyway, so it really loses any other benefit. And same thing with property. Typically we would create the property LLC where the LLC that actually owns the property in the state where the property is located. Again, there are scenarios where we can set it up somewhere, like for example, a lender might require us to have a Delaware entity, for example. But if that property is in Texas, we're going to have to register that entity back into Texas. So when we're talking about property LLCs or operating companies, management LLCs, GP entities, those are typically in the states where you are physically located because that's where you're doing business. Now, you've heard about Nevada in Wyoming and also Delaware sometimes. That's for the holding companies. That's for companies that are not doing any business whatsoever. They're simply sitting there holding the asset. I believe everybody should have some type of a holding company as opposed to owning assets individually directly in their own name. But if I were creating a holding company, that's where I would go to states like Delaware, Wyoming, or Nevada, primarily because of the charging order protection. Those are the states that have the most, I believe, the strongest asset protection laws from a charging order protection. And I just, again, also did a video on charging order protection. But the reason those 3 states, Nevada, Delaware, and Wyoming, are by far the most popular states for holding companies, that they extend charging order protection to single member LLCs. And but when I say single member, it also includes husband and wives. So most of us who are in the syndication business, you hold their assets, it's your company, or you and your spouse have a holding company. Having those in a Wyoming or Nevada or Delaware extend that critical charging order protection to single member LLCs. And again, if you haven't seen the charging order video that I did last Friday, I'd highly encourage you to view that. But that's where that comes in. If you're just creating a business or an operating company, that's going to be in the state that you actually physically reside in, because even if you set it somewhere else, you're going to have to register it back in there. But great question.
Michelle asks, can you do a 506c blind fund?
Great question, Michelle. This is another area of confusion. So 506B has to do with the exemption that you're relying on. Remember, we either always have to register, find an exemption, or it's illegal. So whether it's a 506B, 506C, Reg A, whatever exemption you're going to do, that's separate from the actual structure itself. So structurally speaking, there's really three types of structures that I always talk about that you could potentially do. One is a blind pool, which you reference, which is simply raising the capital first before you identify the property, and then deploying that capital once the money's already in the bank account. So you raise the money, you tell your investors something a little bit vague, hey, I'm going to go buy real estate, and then once the money's in the bank, then you go look for a property, and then bang, you have the money already in the bank when you want to get into contract. That's one type of structure. The other structure is what we call a project-specific structure, where you're actually identifying the property first, you're getting into contract, and then you're raising the money after that with a very specific business plan based on that particular structure. That's a project-specific project-specific syndication. And then there's the third one, which I call the hybrid, which is sort of you're doing a blind fund, so you don't really know what you're going to be buying except for that first property. The first property you've identified, but after you buy that property, the second, third, fourth, fifth property in your blind pool has not been identified. So that's why I call that the hybrid. But no matter what structure you're using, whether it's the blind fund, whether it's a hybrid, or whether it's a project specific, we have to go through that analysis of whether, are we going to register, or are we going to find an exemption? Of course, we're not going to register. We're going to look for that exemption, but that could be a 506B, a 506B, a 506C, a Reg A. Whatever exemption that you want to work on is independent as the type of structure you're using. And in this case, a blind pool absolutely can be, and generally is, by the way, a 506C, because with a blind pool, we typically want to stick to accredited investors only. And once we make that decision, I would say most people go ahead, and especially with a blind pool, would go ahead and do a 506C anyway, because you're going to be limited to accrediteds only. So great question, Michelle. Appreciate that. And again, once again, appreciate all your guys' questions. I'm really enjoying doing these Q&A shows. And again, I'm always looking for questions. So if you've got any questions, please drop it down in the comments, and we'll see you next week.